Not too long ago, I told you a story that you're going to hear again this morning. Saturday morning in Brazil, I awakened. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I had a vision. And it was a vision that day I was going to build a model airplane that would actually fly. I didn't have a kit. I didn't have directions. This is before YouTube. Pretty sure my family didn't even have a computer. We didn't even have a TV. But I knew what an airplane was. I'd seen hundreds, maybe thousands. I had flown dozens of times. But when I pulled out a few old planks and some bits of kindling, a hammer, some rusty nails, maybe an odd set of pliers and a screwdriver, and I kind of laid this junk out on the ground in front of me, I realized I actually had no idea how to actually manufacture an airplane. So what it ended up being was actually a cross. It was a plank with another plank across it, nailed together. I threw it, and it crashed, and that was the end of my aviation career. If you don't have a hard copy Bible with you this morning, and you'd like to borrow one for the rest of the service, the ushers are coming back down the aisles now with some copies, and if you just raise your hand, they'll be glad to give you one. And if you don't own a copy, then please receive this one as a gift from us. Take it, make it your own. We're working our way through the Ten Commandments, and this week is actually our second week on the fourth commandment. When we hear the word Sabbath, I think each of us have an impression or idea that comes to mind. For some of us, it may even be a pleasant thought. But when we actually come to the practical issues of observing the Sabbath, we don't really know what we're doing or maybe even how to make it happen. Last week, we answered the question, what is the Sabbath? And we talked about it being a rhythm, a break, a witness, a blessing, and a communion. Today, we want to look at the practical questions of how we might observe the Sabbath and why we should observe the Sabbath. The idea is that these further understandings, we might actually begin to make it a regular practice, responding to this loving invitation from God to rest and to be restored in a regular rhythm. You may or may not recall that last week I talked about how the Sabbath was a gift from God to the new nation of Israel, who had grown to nation status in the context of slavery. They were entirely, all the nation, all of the people were slaves in Egypt. Never a day off, never a break, oppressive, heavy burdens. And when God frees them from that, one of the things from which he frees that whole nation was, as we might call it today, the rat race. The never-ending expectation of work. And God says to his people, I love you, I created you, I know your limitations, and one of the gifts I'm giving you as a nation, as my people, is that one day out of 7, there will be no burden placed upon you. There will be no requirement for work. In fact, it will be the opposite. It will be a day set apart for me and you to rest and to be together. I'm going to read this command again from Exodus chapter 20. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible as a book, Exodus is the second book of the Bible. The first one's Genesis, the next one's Exodus. And you'll see on the page that each book is broken down into chapters and then verses. So we'll be in chapter 20 of Exodus, and I'll be reading beginning with verse 8 through verse 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The first question that I want us to answer is, how was the Sabbath to be observed then? And then by extension, the Sabbath today is kept by, first of all, remembering. God says, remember the Sabbath day. Now, for any of you who are married, you should know by this point that remembering your anniversary is not just a mental exercise. So if your spouse says to you, you remember that tomorrow's our anniversary, and you say, yeah, I remember, I got it right here, and that's all you ever do or say about it, you failed. You have not remembered. So when God here speaks of remembering the Sabbath, it's not just an intellectual thought. Yeah, I know it's the Sabbath today, or yeah, I know the Sabbath is coming. God's people were to remember the Sabbath by acting certain ways and making certain choices. Secondly, how the Sabbath was to be kept by keeping it holy. So keeping it holy is the first attitude that fleshes out the command to remember it. Now, we've talked before about what the word holy means. It means to be set apart for a specific purpose. But there's another layer to this, and it has to do with the Hebrew or the Jewish understanding of what it meant to be holy, meaning what it meant to be set apart. When we think of being set apart, we think of something off to the side. But in Hebrew and Jewish understanding and language, to be set apart, to be holy meant to be central. So remember the Sabbath day by keeping it central, by keeping it a priority in the middle of our vision and our life. When I was growing up, in particular in high school, junior high and high school, the school that I went to in Brazil, we were part of a small sports league with 5 other schools. Game night was Friday night, and I lived for Fridays. It was my favorite day of the week, hands down. I judged actually the value of every other day of the week by how close it was to Friday. So I actually felt like Saturday was like a downer because I've got to wait 6 more days for game night when we get to play. And to me, to put it in the terms that we see here in Exodus, like that game day, I kept it holy. Right? It was central. Every other day revolved around that day for me. And I want us to see here in the text how this command is bookended by this idea of holiness or centrality. So right at the beginning, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. And then what is the very last phrase of this command? God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. This command begins and ends with holiness, centrality. Keep the Sabbath by making it consistent and central to the rest of your life. In comparison to the Sabbath, then everything else, so all the other days, take a back seat. Thirdly, we keep the Sabbath by working. Now, that might seem odd. Wait, I thought the whole idea was not working on the Sabbath. But notice what verse 9 says. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. That's a positive command, right? You shall labor and do all your work. When? 6 days. So working 6 days is prescriptive. It too is part of the Sabbath command. So in ancient Judaism, and actually in Judaism as it is still practiced today, the Sabbath is Saturday. You know, in our week, it lands on Saturday. Now, last week, as we saw with what the Apostle Paul wrote, I don't think that the actual day of the week chosen to observe the Sabbath is crucial. But I suggest that the most likely one for us today would be Sunday. So working from the perspective of Sunday as Sabbath, that would mean that our perspective on Saturday probably needs to change a bit too. That we need to have a perspective on Saturday as a work day. A day to accomplish all the things that we could not do Monday through Friday of the work week. So things like, upkeep of the house, shopping, running errands, homework, etc. Because in order to keep the Sabbath, we must work. If the Sabbath is central and we keep it central, that means that Saturday needs to serve Sunday rather than the other way around. Now, I also recognize that all of us have different kinds of work schedules. Not everyone is on a Monday to Friday cycle or a Monday to Friday rhythm. Some of you have a floating day off. And I understand that. And so like with Paul, we're not being legalistic about this must be only on Sunday or it must be only on Saturday. The principle is we need rest, and God has ordained that rest, and we need time with him in rest and with our sisters and brothers. So that might make it more challenging to figure out how to observe this rhythm for you, that 1 day out of 7 is set apart for rest and restoration. But I also want all of us to hear very, very clearly that we are trying to desperately avoid legalism on this count. In fact, last week I shared that one of the reasons I think that we do not, as a rule, practice the Sabbath, most of us don't, is because legalism has killed it for us. And just as legalism killed it for the ancient Jewish people as well. This is a positive command from the heart and mind of God. 6 days you shall work. So to be more general, whichever day is your Sabbath, all the other days of the week we should see as work days, days on which we work diligently so that we may enjoy the Sabbath by observing it. Now, fourthly, we observe the Sabbath by preparing and planning. We will never be able to keep the Sabbath and enjoy its fruits if we don't intentionally plan to keep it. That means things like, planning ahead of time. What are we going to eat? What are our meals going to be? Do your shopping, finish your homework, clear your calendar. We need to think through the needs of that day and what we must do to meet those needs. If God is our focus on the Sabbath, then we should honor him by diligently and intentionally preparing. If you ever go on vacation, most of us go to great pains to plan out that vacation. When are we going to leave? What is our transportation going to look like? Where are we going to go? Where are we going to stay? What are we going to eat? How are we going to spend our days? What do we want to see? What do we want to accomplish while we're on vacation? Right? Isn't that most of us the way we plan it out? Nobody that I know of says, hey, we're going to go to vacation sometime, and we're going to go somewhere, and we're going to get there somehow. We'll just see. So planning includes the idea of when Sabbath begins. For the Jews, God was really clear. The Sabbath is from sundown to sundown. God knows us really well, doesn't he? And he knows that our created tendency as his fallible children is that we're going to treat any night or evening when we don't have to work the next day as a party night, right? You don't have to work, so we're not going to actually raise hands on this, but how many of us have shown up, I don't know, Sunday morning at church maybe with a Christian hangover, that may not have involved chemicals of any kind, or maybe it did, but that's between you and God. But the Christian hangover of I just stayed up way too late last night. And I know you could make the argument, well, Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest, so let me sleep in church in peace, right? Like this, I'm observing the Sabbath, I'm keeping it, I'm sleeping, I'm catching up. But God knows us, and he knows our tendency to stretch ourselves too thin. And often to do that in desperate search for entertainment and pleasure. So God says, when I'm giving you this gift of rest, I'm going to invite you to start that the evening before the day, right? So the 24-hour period will start at sundown because I know you, and I know what you're going to try to do, right? If we started in the morning. And that morning begins 8, then becomes 9, then becomes 10, and then becomes 11. So from sundown on the Sabbath, they return to their activities and prepare them for the rest of the week. A few months ago, our older son, Ethan, who's in college, had shared with me and Julie that in the church that he's attending, they were really being challenged to intentionally keep a day of rest. And so he entered into that. I'm really impressed and proud of him. And it hasn't been perfect, and he hasn't succeeded 100% of the time. But what he shared with us was the most difficult and challenging thing was to make sure that he had all of his studying done by Saturday evening so that he could be free on Sunday. And just the pressures of that. And he also shared, I realized how much I procrastinate, how much I have time, but I'm always thinking, I've still got all day Sunday. I've still got Sunday night to study, to cram, to do papers or whatever and get ready for the next week. So part of the most challenging part of keeping this day of rest for him was planning and preparing for it. And he said there was also the opposite, the not opposite necessarily, but the other tendency or temptation, which was to not do all his work and then get to the Sabbath and say, well, God, I'm honoring this day for you. So, if I'm not prepared for my tests or my papers or whatever, that's on you. And he shared that with us too. He's like, I realize, that's not the right answer. 6 days you shall work. So there's a preparing and an intentional planning that goes into making observing the Sabbath possible. Next, we observe the Sabbath by worshiping. The Sabbath is intended to be a day of worship of and communion with God and our spiritual family. And while worship may not be the only aspect of the day, and it's not, together with rest, it is the primary activity. As the text emphasizes, it's a Sabbath to the Lord. He is the creator, the institutor, and the object of the Sabbath. I commented earlier, right? Most couples make some kind of effort to celebrate or at least recognize their wedding anniversary. To do so, they set apart a day or at the very least a meal time to be together, just them, to enjoy each other and to remember and celebrate their relationship. So in a similar way, God gives his church the invitation to regularly, weekly remember and celebrate their relationship, ours with him and his with us. To enjoy his presence together, to worship him as he ministers to us. And that's one of the most powerfully unique things about Sunday morning, actually, is the together piece. Because all of us are invited to worship the Lord every day, right? Every minute. There's an old country song that was every second, every minute, every hour of every day. There's a thought of you that comes my way. I don't think he was singing about God, but the point being, we're always in his presence. We're always invited to worship him. But there's something powerfully unique about the one time a week where we intentionally do that together. That's why it's part of our vision statement at First Friends Church. As First Friends Church, we live to glorify God together. And finally, how do we keep the Sabbath? By resting. One reason that legalism killed or can kill the joy and blessing of the Sabbath is because, here's a news flash, this is going to shock you, people are different. What is genuinely restful and restorative for one person may be exhausting and taxing for another. To be in a large group of people for an entire day, that energizes me. That can be renewing for an extrovert. But for an introvert, that same experience, though perhaps good and even enjoyable, is draining. So for me, going on a short, slow run, again, short and slow are very, very important there. They're my only options, actually. Short, slow run is restorative and energizing and renewing, but for someone else, that kind of exercise would wipe them out. So we need to be careful in how we define rest so that we don't do it legalistically, that we define it in ways that God defines it. So God says there's no work done on the Sabbath, but then he doesn't proceed to give us a 5-volume set listing everything that would be considered work. And yet there are some activities that were condoned on the Sabbath that require physical activity and effort. In fact, Jesus even challenged the Pharisees when they challenged him for healing on the Sabbath. He says, what about you? You're telling me that if your donkey or your ox or one of your livestock falls into a pit on the Sabbath, you're not going to pull it out? You're going to wait till Sunday to pull your animal out of the pit? He's like, no, you'll pull it out. So is it better to do ill and do evil or do good on the Sabbath? So Jews they prepared food on the Sabbath. They were allowed to walk to certain places on the Sabbath. So I suggest that work in this case refers to whatever you do for your income or the upkeep of your home, right? So your job, or if you're a student, your studies. Cleaning the house, washing clothes, sending job-related emails, those are the things that I would suggest would comprise work, and we're to abstain from them in order to rest the body, but also to rest the mind and rest the soul. Rest may also encompass location and place, right? So a park or a coffee shop may be restful, while generally, I'm not saying all the time, but generally a movie theater or circus or arcade is not. Listen to this quote by Walter Brueggemann. It's a long one. Sabbath concerns the periodic, disciplined, regular disengagement from the systems of productivity whereby the world uses people up to exhaustion. That disengagement refers also to culture-produced expectations for frantic leisure, frantic consumptions, or frantic exercise. Remember that the whole world system is influenced by the enemy of God, the enemy of the church, and the enemy of humanity. That entity, the devil and his minions, they hate us. They hate the church, but they hate people in general because we are created in the image of God. So could it be that one way that the enemy of the church, the enemy of humanity, works toward our destruction, because that is his desire, right, to destroy us? Could it be that one of his weapons is drawing us further and further away from Sabbath and the rest of body, soul, and spirit that we so desperately need and which God has ordained and offered to us? Because see, the idea of rest on Sabbath is an act of trust. It acknowledges that God is our provider, that all things come from him. By resting from our work on the Sabbath, we acknowledge that, God, you are in control, and you are the provider. You are the one who cares for us. Now we're going to shift here briefly from how we should observe the Sabbath to why. And this is actually somewhat brief. There are only 2 points here. But the first one is because God did. All of these 10 commandments are based on the activity and nature of God. He modeled the Sabbath for us. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy. He made it central. A time, and you notice that God made the seventh day central to him as well. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. He rested on that day. It's not just him making that day central for us, but it's central to him as well. So he's inviting us to join him in keeping this day central to our relationship with him and his with us. He blessed the seventh day and made it holy, a time for him to commune with himself and rest from his labors. We are made in his image and made to imitate his activity and love. In 1976, the first Rocky movie was released. And for those of you of a certain maturity, age, you might recall a scene near the beginning of that movie when Rocky wakes up in a really squalid little apartment and he has his breakfast. And his breakfast is 5 raw eggs broken into a glass, which he then drinks. And I rewatched this scene just to capture it in all its glory. And, bits of egg white and yolk kind of run down his chin and onto his his sweatsuit, that he slept in, that he was about to work out in, and then he wipes his mouth with his sleeve. And actually, that was the most impressive part to me about it, just how gross that whole thing was. But here's the point. After that movie came out, it was such a huge hit. There was this incredible uptick in people trying to drink raw eggs for breakfast, because somehow that was going to make them like Rocky. That was going to make them professional level boxers. It was going to take them from utter obscurity to this incredible level of fitness whereby they could get center stage. A lot of kids did this, or at least did it once, right? But that power of imitation, Rocky did it, I'm going to do it. If God is truly our God, if he's our fortress, our deliverer, our lover, our redeemer, our sovereign, then we should be and desire to imitate him and honor him. So he takes a Sabbath and invites us to join him in it. Let's imitate him and say, yes, God, you do this. God, somehow this is essential to your nature, and you're inviting us to join you in it? Absolutely, yes. I want to imitate you and follow your lead in the Sabbath. Secondly, we need it. This is kind of the obvious point here, right? The gift of the Sabbath acknowledges our human limitations. Observing the Sabbath is an act of admitting that we're not super people, that we're not infallible, that we cannot sustain never-ending stress without consequences. And some of you have been forced by life circumstances to live in that condition, some of you for years, maybe because you're caring for a loved one who is ill. And maybe there are other life issues that have happened that have required you to be, quote unquote, on, right? 7 days a week for years. So you've lived this reality. You know what I'm talking about, that we cannot sustain never-ending stress without consequence. And for those of you who have been forced to live that way, so some of us live that way by choice. Some of you have been forced to live that way. For those of you who have been forced by life circumstances to live that way, I just want you to hear me say, there is no condemnation on you for this. So what I don't want you to hear is you can't care for that loved one who's sick on the Sabbath. Obviously not. But I would invite you, one thing I would invite you to do, if that describes your situation, is to seek prayer from sisters and brothers in Christ. Whether you do that, here at the altar, as you're welcome to do, or just privately, and just say, I need prayer because I know I need rest, but because of my life situation, I just can't get it. But knowing that burden is being helped, that sisters and brothers are carrying that burden along with you in prayer, is also a way that God brings rest. Now, there are some who are more naturally blessed with energy that maybe can go, full speed for weeks or months, but even they will eventually run down and burn out. Do you live for the weekend? Only to find that when Sunday evening comes, you're more exhausted than you were on Friday afternoon? Like you're no more ready, prepared to face the week than you were at the end of the previous one? In writing on the Sabbath, theologian Wayne Muller says this: if we do not allow for a rhythm of rest in our overly busy lives, illness becomes our Sabbath. Our pneumonia, our cancer, our heart attack, our accidents create Sabbath for us. Please don't take that out of context. He's not saying that right now, if you are ill or if you're facing one of these challenges, it's punishment from God because you didn't keep the Sabbath. He's just reflecting the reality that we were not created with the capacity for never-ending stress and work. And that if we insist on that lack of rhythm, that our bodies and our minds and our souls, we will ultimately pay the price for trying to live in a way for which we were not created. If we will acknowledge our need for rest and worship and keep that need central, God will honor and bless us by meeting with us and strengthening us. Observing the Sabbath acknowledges God as the only sovereign, the only God, the only King, and our resting in him delights him and will delight us. It gives us the opportunity to enjoy him, his people, and his good gifts. We need it. And you know what else the regular practice of Sabbath can do? It can help break our belief that my value comes from what I produce or accomplish. Because we have been taught that by the world. You are valuable in so much as and insofar as you can produce or accomplish. And God says, no, you're not. You're valuable because I created you, and you're valuable because you are in relationship with me and I love you. And there's no other reason. So I'm going to get to the application. And it's a really complicated application, and here it is. Are you ready? Try it. So I want to invite you, I want to challenge all of us to try out a Sabbath. Some of you may already have this regular practice, and I honor you and I commend you for that. And I just encourage you to continue with it. So I want to be very careful that this is not about being legalistic. So I just want to give you a suggestion, kind of a template for how you as individuals and families maybe could go about experiencing and observing a Sabbath. So for those who work 6 days a week and you have a floating day off, I'll give you another suggestion at the end. But to begin with, though, I want to address those who work Monday through Friday as a general rule. So I recommend choose a Sunday, and I suggest Sunday because it already has the worship component built into it. Then set that Sunday apart ahead of time, right? Pray over it, dedicate it to God as a Sabbath to him, and commit to him. Hey, we're going to observe, God, we're going to observe your Sabbath on this particular day. Then prepare for it. So figure out what you need to do ahead of time so you can be at peace, so you can rest on that day. Use the Saturday before to buy groceries, plan your meals, clean your house, do laundry, be ready, do homework. And then in the early Saturday evening, around 6 or so, again, we're not being legalistic about this, begin your Sabbath. So, and I would invite you to mark the beginning of that Sabbath intentionally. If you're part of a family, gather the family to pray together and just acknowledge this. Okay, we're starting the Sabbath and we're marking it with prayer. If you live alone or don't have family nearby, maybe you could do this with a small group of friends. Have a pleasant, calm evening, a meal together, maybe some peaceful family activities, a game, a book, a conversation. And I know, let me tell you something else. I know, and there's grace for this, a number of you have small children. And you're just like right now saying, what world do you live in? Nathaniel, you have kids, but obviously it's been far too long since they were young, and you have totally forgotten our reality. Please know that I haven't forgotten it. The poignancy of it may have dimmed a little bit, but I have not forgotten it. So I understand that there's a far greater challenge there, right? To understand how to create this practice in the context of a family with little children. But I also suggest that little children are moldable and teachable. And they can, I'm not saying it comes without effort, but they can be taught also the importance of rest and calm. And remember, I'm not saying do nothing, but I'm saying intentionally choose activities that are, especially that evening, that are a little, maybe lend themselves to being a little more calm. And then, this is the huge one, go to bed early. And again, if you've got young kids, you're saying, But I invite you to try that, so that we awaken on Sunday morning early enough so we're not rushed to get to church, we're not going crazy. And then we come to church, we worship, we enjoy Christ and his body, and then we go home. And then again, in planning, we've planned in advance if we're going to have lunch alone or with friends, but then enjoy a good lunch and enjoy conversation, relaxation, whatever activity energizes and restores you. And for some, that's going to be a Sunday afternoon nap. Go for it. And again, those of you with kids are saying, what? I encourage you, and again, this is not about being legalistic, but I would encourage you that on the Sabbath, you keep your screen time to a minimum. And the reason I say that is just because if we're honest with ourselves, our screens rarely renew and restore us. They offer that. They tempt us with that, just veg out or doom scroll or whatever it is. But the truth is usually after we have lifted up our souls to our screens, we are more exhausted at the end of that than we are restored. So that's just a suggestion. That's not a command. Enjoy the afternoon, rest, relax, enjoy God and his gifts. And when sundown comes, the Sabbath ends. And then if you need to prepare for the week to come, you can begin thinking of that at that time. And I may be wrong, but as I was preparing this, because I told you last week, this is a difficult one for me and my family to observe regularly. It's a challenge. So as I'm issuing this invitation, I found myself thinking this, okay, I got to pick a Sunday when I don't have a conflict. But even the fact that that's where my thinking goes already shows me that I'm behind the 8 ball because I've already given the Sabbath, I have not kept it central. If I had kept it central, I wouldn't have to work hard to find a Sunday when I don't have another commitment or something else I'm doing already. And so that was just sort of a bit of a wake-up call to me. Every yes carries an implied no, right? We can't do it all. And a Sabbath will mean saying no to some things. Again, as Walter Brueggemann said, Sabbath practice is not to be added on to everything else, but requires the intentional breaking of requirements that seem almost ordained in our busy life. Now, to those of you who have only one day off, you don't have quote unquote, the luxury of a Saturday and a Sunday, then I would encourage you to start by setting apart half a day. The night before your day off, you make it a point to get to bed early on your day off, get up at a realistic time, set apart the morning to accomplish things that need doing, set apart the afternoon and evening for your Sabbath. And I realize that a lot of this is going to, it takes some creativity. For those of you who have young children, again, if you're a single parent, it's going to take even more effort, and I recognize that, and I honor you for caring for your kids well. That is a challenge. For those of you who are married, it's going to take creativity. There may be some tag teaming and trading off Sabbath hours. Hey, this is our Sabbath. These are going to be your Sabbath hours. These are going to be my Sabbath hours. Let's tag team. Let's work together. The reason I'm inviting us to try this is, could it be that we've missed out on some of God's greatest blessings by ignoring this great gift? We talked last week about how it feels like a burden. Oh, I got to observe Sabbath. No, you don't got to. We get to. We get to. So I invite you to try it. You may find that you do like yogurt after all. If you remember how I opened the sermon last week. But what we're actually seeking in all of this is to walk closely with Jesus. And if God has given us this gift, not only offered to us, but enacted by Him, why would we resist so much stepping into that with Him? I'd invite you to stand. We'll be worshiping the Lord of the Sabbath together. And as I say each week, the altars are open. And if you're invited to come. You can stand, you can kneel, you can worship the Lord, be in His presence, respond to Him in this way. If you want someone to pray for you or with you, just come to this side of the altar and a prayer minister will join you there.